Hi, Mamlaya Paladin. I am Hazel D. Deloria, and my discussion is all about the input hypothesis under the principles and practice in second language acquisition. The input hypothesis is very important in both theoretical and practical sense. This hypothesis attempts to answer what is perhaps the most important question in our field as an English major students. This question is, how do we acquire language? In this discussion, we will be presenting the analysis by giving the supporting evidence as that helps us study in first and second language acquisition, especially in applied linguistic research. One of the important theory discussion about this hypothesis that as Hatch in 1978 pointed out that we first learn structures, then practice using them in communication, and this is how fluency develops. The input hypothesis says the opposite. It says we acquire by going for meaning first, and as a result, we acquire structure. We may thus parts 1 and of course input hypothesis as follows. The input hypothesis relates the acquisition and not learning, and second, we acquire by understanding language that contains structure as it beyond our current level of competence. 1 I plus 1, and this is done with the help of context and or extra linguistic information. Part 3 of the input hypothesis, it says that when communication is successful, when the input is understood and there is enough of it, I plus 1 is will be provided automatically. The final part of the input hypothesis states that speaking fluency can be taught directly, which is true. Rather, it emerges over time on its own. The best way, and perhaps the only way, is simply to provide comprehensible input. Earlier speech will come when the acquirer feels ready. This state of readiness arrives at somewhat different times for different people. However, earlier speech, moreover, is typically not grammatically accurate. The part 4 of the input hypothesis is thus production ability emerges. It is not taught directly. Now, when we emerge to our very own language, of course, we didn't learn it at first hand. We learn it through communication, through everyday usage, and the inputs we used and we garnered during the process is one of the main factor why that input hypothesis is very important of the of practicing a second language, especially in English. Evidence supporting the hypothesis. First, language acquisition in children. The input hypothesis is very consistent with what is known about caretaker speech, the modifications that parents and others makes when talking to young children. Rather, as Clark and Clark in 1977 point out, a third characteristic of caretaker speech that concerns us is known as the here and now principle. It is well established that caretakers talk mostly about what the children can perceive. What is the immediate environment caretaker speech is modified in order to aid comprehension. Caretakers talk simpler in effort of themselves understood by the children. The input hypothesis predicts the caretaker speech will be very useful for children, which is true. When we learn of our first language as a child, we observe those people, and then we usually use here and now as our immediate response, like, here, come mommy, I want to pee, or now I want to play with my classmates. Now, those are responses that a child might commit during his or her early childhood. You know, learning language is simple as a piece of cake in child, but in adult, it's very difficult. It takes time, and preferably the structure of it might take time as we learn new things, because again, English is very dynamic. It's not static. after all. The input hypothesis is very persistent with the results of what can be carried a method comparison experiments. Groups of students studying second and foreign language using two different methods are compared, both in long-term and short-term studies. Studies comparing the more commonly used methods, the audiolingual as compared to grammar translation or cognitive code as follows. First, we have deductive method, rules first, then practice example grammars, or cognitive codes as follows. And the deductive method, rules first and then practice examples grammar, translation, and cognitive code are slightly more efficient than audiolingual at teaching for adults. The difference are often statistically significant but are not huge. Students clearly make some progress using any of these approaches, and for adults, there is no measurable difference. Just observe a teacher and a student relationship. Now, if a teacher uses the audiolingual type of approach, of course, it might be effective to some students, but mostly it's not. It's difficult and hard to prepare to what do you call this one, to implement, but we used to have the grammar translation and the cognitive code. Say for example, a teacher explains his or her lesson in English, but later on along the discussion they will use the vernacular language, or for us the Bisaya, because it's very easy for those students to learn something if it is translated. And I am one of those students who can learn quick if the teacher will translate, explains in vernacular, even if his or her first attempt is explaining it in English. Reports confirming the superiority of such input methods have been appearing in the professional literature over the past 10 years. Most important, the input hypothesis predicts that the classroom may be excellent place for second language acquisition, and at least up to intermediate level, which is true. We can observe this. For beginners, the classroom can much better than the outside world, since the outside usually provides the beginner with very little comprehensible input. In the classroom, we can provide an hour a day of comprehensible input, which is probably much better than the outside can do for a beginner. Let us remember that language acquisition can only be effective if the student is willing to learn, and the teacher is very effective in disseminating his or her lessons. Now, we must at least know that as for the beginners, they don't have what they call this one. They don't have proper way of learning English as their second language. But we are privileged, we are very privileged to learn this in classroom, and we must at least give this as our sword, outside the world, that not everyone has the chance to learn such a prestigious language, not the English one. So I want to ponder this to everyone who is learning and listening to me, that it takes time and it takes effort to learn a language, and let us put in our hearts, in our minds, that everything will follow if we love what we are doing. And that's what we all. Thank you, and God bless us all. See you in the next video. Goodbye.